Vivian made a small sound that was almost a laugh. "Fix this thing and I'll marry you, Mr. Whittaker." Her assistants laughed. It was Preston who laughed loudest, and the loudest sound in a room is sometimes the one a man makes to cover something underneath it. I didn't know that yet. I only knew it didn't sit right. I did not respond. I latched the engine cover gently. I took a clean shop rag from my back pocket and wiped my hands. I'll need access to the car for 3 working days. I can do most of the work here if you have a stable power source in the garage, or I can flatbed it to my shop in Stamford and bring it back when it's finished. Your preference. "Here is fine," she said. The amusement in her voice had thinned a little. She had registered that I had not laughed at her joke. I was not sure she had registered why. "I'll be back tomorrow morning at 8 if that works. Eleanor will give you the gate code." I nodded. I walked back to the truck. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. My phone was in the cup holder. I picked it up and scrolled to a contact I had not called in almost 2 years. Klaus Reinhardt, 71 years old, retired Porsche engineer, lived in a small house in Yonkers, in Westchester County, about 30 minutes from Greenwich. I had met him at a vintage Porsche event at Lime Rock Park in 2017, and he had recognized something in my background within 10 minutes of speaking with me. We had stayed in occasional contact ever since. I did not call him from the driveway. I started the truck and drove back toward Stamford. I called him from the kitchen of my apartment 30 minutes later, after I had checked the time and confirmed that Hannah's pickup was on schedule and the M5 in the shop could wait until tomorrow. Klaus answered on the 4th ring. His voice was the same as it always was, slow, deliberate, with the precise consonants of someone who had learned English as an adult and never let it become casual. "Ethan." "Klaus. I need you to confirm something for me. Tell me." Heinrich Miller built 7 brackets outside of Manthe's official production. Personal projects. I worked on 2 of them. Do you know which years and which cars? There was a long pause. Why do you ask? Because I just saw one. Another pause, longer than the first. Where? In a garage in Greenwich. A 1973 Carrera RS lightweight. Grand Prix white. Bracket has the MR04 stamp. The car was bought by an American collector in Frankfurt in 1991, kept in Germany for some years, then imported. Klaus exhaled. That's the car Heinrich brought to the Manthe workshop in the summer of 2010 for a refresh. You worked on it. I worked on it. He had owned it personally for 2 years and sold it to fund his son's medical school. The buyer was through a broker in Frankfurt. Heinrich never met him. The buyer was an American. Yes, Heinrich said the broker mentioned that. Charles Ashworth, I think. I was sitting at my kitchen table. I had not realized I had sat down. That's the family. The car is now owned by the daughter. She doesn't know any of this. Klaus was quiet for a long moment. Ethan. Heinrich kept records of every car he personally rebuilt. Handwritten, bound. 7 volumes by the time he died. After his funeral in 2018, his daughter Anneliese inherited the volumes as his sole heir. She loaned them to the Porsche Museum Archive in Stuttgart on a long-term basis. They are accessible to her at any time. You're saying his original logs from 2010 are with Anneliese, available through the museum. Yes, with your signature on the work order pages. I have seen them, 2 years ago when I visited. I closed my eyes for a moment. Klaus, I'm going to ask you for a favor. Tell me. I need a high-resolution scan of every page in the 2010 volume that references this car. I'll cover the cost of the museum's reproduction service. I need it within a week. I will call Anneliese tomorrow morning. She still has the volumes in her custody for research purposes. She can scan them directly. faster than the museum's general request system. Thank you, Klaus. Ethan. Yes. You should know. Heinrich talked about you specifically in the 2010 volume. Not just the signature. He wrote a short note about an American apprentice who understood the work without needing it explained twice. He used your first name. He liked you. I did not say anything for a while. Send me the scans when you have them. I will. I ended the call. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. I thought about Heinrich. I thought about the summer of 2010 and the smell of the workshop at the Nürburgring and the way he had taught me to feel a misfire through the floor of the bay instead of just hearing it. I thought about Caroline, who had been 22 years old in 2010, who had visited me in Germany for 2 weeks in August, who had walked through that workshop and met Heinrich and laughed at something he said about how American men were too quick to assume that volume meant power. I let myself go back there for a few minutes, because some days you have to pay the toll before grief lets you keep moving. It was a Saturday in August, hot for Germany, the kind of heat that made the workshop smell like cut grass and gear oil, and the sweet rot of the hayfields beyond the perimeter fence. Heinrich had the Carrera's nose up on stands, and I was on my back underneath it, with degreaser running down my forearm and into my collar. And Caroline was sitting on an overturned tire with a paperback she wasn't reading, watching us instead. He talks to it, she said to Heinrich, nodding at me. Did you know that? He talks to engines like they can hear him. They can hear him, Heinrich said, without looking up from the valve cover he was cleaning. Most men only listen for the engine to stop talking. This one listens while it's still saying something. Caroline laughed, that specific laugh she had, low and a little surprised at herself, like she hadn't expected to find the joke that funny until it was already out of her mouth. You're going to ruin him for American shops, you know that. He's never going to be satisfied with a code reader again. Good, Heinrich said. A code reader tells you what already happened. I am trying to teach him to know what is about to happen. I didn't say anything. I just kept working, because I didn't have the words yet for what it felt like to have the two most important teachers of my life standing 4 feet apart, talking about me like I was a car they were both restoring. 10 years later, I would stand in a hospital room in Stamford and watch Caroline's hand go slack around mine. And I would think about that afternoon in Heinrich's shop more than I thought about almost anything else from our life together, because it was the only memory I had of her where she looked completely, uncomplicatedly happy, with nothing yet asking anything of her. She had died on October 16, 2020, stage 4 metastatic breast cancer. She had been 32 years old. Hannah had been 3. I had quit Manthe Racing 2 months later. I had moved back to Connecticut and opened the shop in Stamford in March of 2021. I had not been back to Germany since. The doorbell rang downstairs. Mrs. Sullivan was bringing Hannah up from school. I stood up. I put my phone in my pocket. I went to the door. Hannah came in wearing her plaid uniform skirt and the navy cardigan I had bought her in August, with her wooden toy car in her right hand. The car her grandfather, my father, had carved for her out of black walnut the year she was born. A small, simple thing. 2 in long. 4 wheels that actually turned. She carried it everywhere. Daddy, Mrs. Sullivan says we can have pasta tonight. Then we can have pasta. She nodded, as if this had been a serious negotiation that had resolved in her favor, and went to put her backpack in her room. I stood in the kitchen a second longer than I needed to, listening to her narrate something to no one in her room. And I thought, the way I thought most evenings, that grief and love had turned out to be the same muscle. And some days I couldn't tell which one I was using. I started boiling water. I went back to Vivian's estate the next morning at exactly 8 horns. The gate code worked. The young man at the gatehouse was different, but he had my name. I parked in the same place. The garage doors were already open. A young man in coveralls was waiting near the Porsche. He introduced himself as Marco, mechanic on staff at the estate, primarily responsible for routine maintenance on the daily driver cars. He had been instructed to assist me with anything I needed and to provide access to the storage area where parts could be ordered to. I told him I needed a clean workbench, access to a 110V outlet, and someone to take a delivery from a parts supplier in Pennsylvania that I would arrange. Otherwise, I needed to be left alone. He nodded. He pointed at a workbench against the far wall that was already cleaner than my workbench at the shop. He pointed at 3 outlets. He gave me a phone extension for the main house in case I needed anything else and walked away. I noticed 2 things about Marco before I noticed anything else that morning. The first was that he was good at his job. The daily cars in that garage were maintained the way cars are maintained by someone who actually cares whether the customer gets home safely. The second was that every 20 minutes or so, without fail, he stepped just outside the garage doors to take a phone call he clearly didn't want me to hear, and came back in adjusting his expression like a man putting his face back on. I didn't think much of it that first morning. I would think about it constantly. Later, I set up. For the first 90 minutes, I did nothing except photograph the engine bay from 23 different angles, document the existing modifications, and write down every part number I could read. I did this slowly and methodically because I needed to be certain that the Heinrich modifications were as I remembered them. They were: the oil scavenge pump bracket, a specific reinforcement plate on the lower crankcase, a custom oil cooler routing that ran the lines through a different path than factory specification. All of it Heinrich's work. All of it consistent with what was in my notebook in the locked drawer in Stamford. At 9:47, Vivian came into the garage. She was wearing jeans and a sweater. Her hair was down. She had a coffee mug in her hand. "Elena said you've been here since 80 years. Have you slept?" Yes. That was a yes or no answer to the wrong question. It was the answer to the question you actually asked. She made the small, almost laugh sound again. She walked to the bench, looked at my notes, looked at the photographs on my phone, did not touch anything. "What are you doing right now?" "Documenting. Before I take anything apart, I need to know what was here when I started." "Why?" "Because if something is missing later, I want to be able to prove it wasn't me." She looked at me for a moment. "That's an unusual concern for a mechanic to have. It's an unusual car." She nodded slowly. She stood near the workbench and watched me work for about 10 minutes. She did not ask anything else. Then she said, "I have a call. I'll be back later." She left. I worked through the rest of the morning. By noon, I had identified the aftermarket replacement part. It was an oil scavenge pump from a company in California that produced parts for resto-mod builds, which is to say, for owners who didn't care about period correctness. The part itself was well made. It was just wrong for this engine, and it had been installed in a way that disabled the Heinrich bracket's intended function entirely. More importantly, the installation looked like work done by someone who knew exactly what they were disabling. Bad mechanics make mistakes that look like ignorance. This mistake looked like intention wearing a disguise. I sat with that for a while. I drove back to Stamford that evening, picked Hannah up from Mrs. Sullivan's apartment downstairs, made dinner, read her 2 chapters of the book we were working through, put her to bed, and then sat down at my kitchen table with my phone and pulled up the public records search I had a subscription to. I searched for Ashworth Capital Management. I read the firm's regulatory filings. I read the most recent Form ADV filed with the SEC. I read the disclosed list of personally titled vehicles included in the firm's principal asset documentation, which was required because the cars were collateralized against personal lines of credit Vivian had drawn against to fund certain firm operations. The 1973 Porsche 911 Carrera RS 2.7 was listed on the schedule. It was valued on the most recent filing dated July 2024 at $385,000. A real, properly authenticated factory-matching numbers 1973 Carrera RS Lightweight, with a verified Heinrich Miller restoration provenance and Porsche Museum archive documentation, would auction in the current market for somewhere between $1.4 million and $1.8 million. The Heinrich provenance alone added probably $400,000 to the value because of how few of his personal restorations existed. The car had been deliberately devalued on the firm's books by approximately $1 million. I read the number twice to make sure I hadn't misplaced a decimal somewhere out of wishful thinking. I hadn't. I sat at that kitchen table with Hannah's cereal bowl still in the sink and the refrigerator humming behind me. And for the first time since I'd walked into that garage, I understood that I wasn't looking at a car problem anymore. I was looking at a man's signature on a document that was lying for him, and men who build that kind of lie do not enjoy being found out by a mechanic with a flip phone's worth of patience. I sat with that for a long time. Before I went to bed, I checked the deadbolt on the apartment door twice, which was not something I had ever done before in that building, and I told myself it had nothing to do with anything. Then I went to bed. The next morning, I called James Holloway. James was an attorney I had met through Dr. Caldwell, the Mercedes owner. He practiced commercial litigation in Stamford with a small firm that handled mostly business disputes and estate matters. I had used him once 2 years ago to draft the operating agreement for the shop. He was 52, careful, and had the kind of practical mind that did not waste motion on things that didn't matter. I told him I needed 30 minutes of his time and that I would pay his consultation rate. He asked me what it was about. I told him I'd rather explain in person. He had an opening at 4 that afternoon. I took it. I drove to his office on Atlantic Street in Stamford at 3:50. I brought a printout of the SEC filing, my photographs from the garage, the auction comparable for 1973 Carrera RS Lightweight with verified provenance, and a brief one-page summary of what I had observed. James read everything without speaking. It took him about 12 minutes. When he was done, he looked up. "You're saying someone has been inside this engine bay and made changes specifically designed to defeat authentication of the car's restoration history?" "Yes, and the car is currently valued on the firm's books at less than a quarter of its actual market value." "Yes, and the person who would have authority to do both of those things is the same person, Preston Vance. I don't know for certain, but the timing fits, and he's the only person at the firm who would have the kind of access to make those changes and the motive to depress the valuation." "What's the motive?" "He's preparing to acquire it, or already has on paper through some related party transaction that we'd need to see the firm's internal records to identify. If he can get the car titled to himself or to a controlled entity at the depressed valuation, and then sell it for actual market value, he pockets the difference, about $1 million. And if Vivian doesn't know what the car actually is, she has no reason to question the valuation." James leaned back in his chair. "You know what you're describing is a federal crime." "Yes, wire fraud at minimum. Likely embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty depending on the specific structure." "Yes." He leaned forward again. "I want you to understand something before we go further," he said. "Men like this don't usually go quietly. If he figures out where the doubt about that valuation came from, he is not going to threaten his accountant. He's going to come looking for the person who started asking questions. That's you. I've already thought about that. I'm not asking if you've thought about it. I'm asking if you're prepared for it. I didn't answer that part directly, because I didn't have an honest answer that wouldn't have made him close the file right there. I just told him I'd already decided, and he let it go, the way good lawyers let go of questions they already know they won't like the answer to. He was quiet for a moment. "Why are you here, Ethan? Why not just finish the car and walk away?" Because she didn't know what she was looking at when she asked me to look at it. And because the man who built that engine taught me something about how this work is supposed to be done. And because if I walk away, she loses the car, and probably much more than the car. Preston Vance didn't strike me as someone who steals from one place and stops. James studied me for a long moment. "I can't represent you formally because I'm not your lawyer in this matter. But I can tell you what I would do if a client brought me this. I would prepare a confidential briefing memo with the documentation. I would identify a forensic accountant who specializes in hedge fund irregularities, and I would advise that client to find a way to put this information in front of Ms. Ashworth in a manner that gave her time to verify it and act on it before Mr. Vance had any indication that she knew." "How would you put it in front of her?" "I would give her my card and tell her to call me about a related matter. I would not put anything in writing that could be intercepted. I would let her come to me. Can I tell her you'd take her call? You can tell her that James Holloway in Stamford handles matters of this kind, and that she should call my direct line. I'll give you the number." He wrote it on the back of his business card. I paid for the consultation. I drove back to Greenwich the next morning and continued working on the car. I sourced a period-correct replacement oil scavenge pump from a specialist in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, named Walter Brennan, who had a private inventory of NOS Porsche parts from the early 70s. The part arrived by overnight freight on the afternoon of September 20th. I installed it the next day. The fit against the Heinrich bracket was exactly what it should have been. The seal was clean. The pressure test came back nominal. I drove the car for the first time on the afternoon of September 22nd. I took it on a 40-mile loop through Greenwich and into Westchester County and back. The misfire did not return. The pressure held. The car ran the way Heinrich had built it to run. I came back to the estate. Vivian was on the lawn near the pool on a phone call. She saw me return and finished the call. "It's running properly. How would you like to confirm it?" "I'd like to drive it." "It's your car." She took the keys. She drove it down the driveway and out the gate. She was gone for about 40 minutes. When she came back, she got out of the car slowly. She closed the door behind her with the particular care of someone who has just remembered why she loved something. She walked over to where I was waiting near the truck. "What do I owe you?" I quoted 3 days at $800 per day, plus the part, which was $400. $20,800 total. "I want to pay you $10,000. "You don't." She looked at me. "Why not?" "Because I quoted you $2,800, and that's what the work was worth. You can pay me extra if you want to feel generous, but it won't change what the work was worth." She held my eyes for a moment. "You're an unusual person, Ethan Whittaker." I did not respond to that directly. I reached into my chest pocket and took out James Holloway's business card. I handed it to her. "What is this?" "That's an attorney in Stamford, James Holloway. He's good. I think you should call him." "About what?" "About a related matter. He'll explain when you call him." She looked at the card. She looked at me. She looked at the Porsche. "Ethan, what did you find?" "I'm not the right person to explain it to you. James is. Please call him. The sooner the better." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded once. She put the card in her pocket. She paid me the $2,800 by transfer to my business account before I left the property. I drove home. I picked Hannah up from school. I made dinner. I tried not to think about it for the rest of the night. She called James the next morning. I did not hear what they discussed in detail. James called me the day after, on September 24th. to tell me only that Ms. Ashworth had retained him formally and that the matter was now under privilege. He thanked me for the referral and said he could not discuss specifics, but that he had recommended she engage a forensic accountant immediately. I went back to my regular work, the Audi RS5, the M5. A new intake came in on a 2019 Volvo XC90 from a couple in Westport. 2 weeks passed. On October 9th, I received a phone call from a woman who introduced herself as Anna Petrov. She was a forensic accountant working with James Holloway on the Ashworth Capital matter. She wanted to ask me a few specific questions about my observations regarding the Porsche, the modifications I had identified, and the dates I could reasonably attribute to the aftermarket replacement work. The conversation took about 40 minutes. She was precise. She asked good questions. She wrote nothing down that I could hear, but I assumed she was recording. At the end of the call, she said, "Mr. Whittaker, I want you to understand that the car was the smallest part of what was happening. I can't share details, but the scale of the broader pattern is significant. Your observation is what led us to where we are." I asked her what she meant by significant. She said, 8 figures. I did not ask any more questions. I hung up the phone and stood in my own kitchen for a long time without turning on a light, even though it was getting dark outside. 8 figures meant this wasn't a man skimming a little off the side to cover a bad year. 8 figures meant a system, built carefully, over years, by someone patient enough to wait for the right car to misfire at the right time. I had pulled one loose thread on a 51-year-old engine bracket, and somewhere underneath the whole estate, something much larger had just started to come apart. The next week, on October 17th, James called me again. He said Ms. Ashworth had decided to proceed with both civil and criminal action. The civil complaint would be filed in Connecticut Superior Court in Hartford County in early November. The criminal referral would be made to the FBI's New Haven field office because of the interstate financial transactions, which would push it into federal jurisdiction. He also said that, given my role as the person whose technical analysis had identified the initial irregularity, I would likely be called as a witness in both proceedings. He asked if I would be willing. I said yes. He said he would prepare me when the time came. The civil complaint was filed on November 8, 2024, in Hartford County Superior Court. The case was styled Ashworth Capital Management versus Vance et al. The allegations included breach of fiduciary duty, conversion of firm assets, fraudulent misrepresentation on regulatory filings, and self-dealing through related party transactions. The complaint named Preston Vance personally and 2 LLCs he controlled. Preston was served at his Greenwich home on November 12, 2024, by a process server at 7:14 in the evening. The FBI executed a search warrant at the Ashworth Capital offices and at Preston Vance's residence on November 14, 2024. Federal charges of wire fraud and embezzlement were filed sealed in the U.S. District Court for the District of Connecticut and were unsealed on November 19, when Preston was formally arrested at his home and processed at the New Haven field office. He was released on a $500,000 appearance bond the same day. Vivian called me on November 16th, 2 days after the search of the offices, and asked if she could come by the shop that evening after Hannah was asleep. I told her yes. She arrived a little after 9, without an assistant, without makeup, wearing a coat that looked like she'd grabbed it off a hook without checking if it was the right one for the weather. She stood just inside the bay doors for a moment before she said anything, looking at the M5 up on the lift, like it was the only normal thing left in her week. Preston flew to Aspen with my father the year I turned 16, she said, not as a greeting, just as the thing sitting closest to the surface. My father had just had his first cardiac scare and didn't want to tell my mother yet, and he didn't want to be alone, and he called Preston instead of calling me. I used to think that meant something good about Preston. I used to think it meant my father trusted him more than he trusted his own family with the truth, and that Preston had earned that. She wasn't crying. She looked more like someone doing math she didn't want to be doing. Now I think it just meant my father was lonely, and Preston was good at being whoever the room needed him to be. He was good at it for 30 years. He was good at it with me for 10. You don't have to explain any of this to me. I know I don't. I'm not explaining it to you. I'm saying it out loud for the first time, where it isn't a deposition. She finally looked at me. Did you know, when you found that bracket, that it would go this far? No. Would you have told me anyway, if you'd known? I thought about that honestly before I answered, because she deserved an honest answer more than a comforting one. Yes. She nodded, like that was the only acceptable answer, and she needed to hear me actually arrive at it instead of just say it. Then she asked if she could sit on the tire stack the way she'd seen mechanics do in movies, and I said sure, and we didn't talk about the case again for the next 20 minutes. We talked about her father's funeral, which she said she barely remembered, and about Hannah's drawings, which I'd left taped to the shop refrigerator, and about how strange it was that the most honest conversation she'd had in months was happening in a garage that smelled like brake cleaner. When she left, she didn't say thank you. She just touched the hood of the M5 once on her way out, like she was saying goodbye to something, and told me she'd call when she heard from the FBI again. Between November 19th and November 23rd, 3 things happened that I didn't think much of until afterward. On the 20th, a black Suburban with Connecticut plates sat across the street from the shop for almost 40 minutes around the time school usually let out, then pulled away before I could finish writing down the plate number. On the 21st, the shop's landline rang twice and went dead both times before I could say more than hello. On the 22nd, I got a call from Stamford Academy's front office asking, politely, whether I had recently updated the list of people authorized to pick Hannah up, because someone claiming to be a family friend had called that morning asking what time she got out of school. I told them no, I hadn't updated anything, and that no one besides Mrs. Sullivan and myself should ever be on that list. The woman on the phone said she'd flag it and let me know if it happened again. It didn't happen again through the school. It happened in person, the next day, in my own shop. On November 23, 2024, at 11:48 in the morning, Preston Vance came to my shop in Stamford. I was alone at the bench. Hannah was at school. Mrs. Sullivan was at a doctor's appointment. The shop was quiet enough that I heard the bell over the door before I fully registered the door itself opening. And something about that quiet put the hair up on the back of my neck before I'd even turned around. He came in through the front door without knocking. He was wearing a charcoal overcoat and the same expensive loafers from September. His face was harder. His tan had faded, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked like a man who had started losing instead of a man who had never considered the possibility. "Mr. Whittaker, you shouldn't be here. I'll be brief. I have an offer for you. I'm not interested." He set a folded check on my workbench anyway, the way a man places a bet he's already decided he can afford to lose. I did not look at it. $200,000. In exchange, you cease cooperation with the federal investigation. You become unavailable as a witness. You can claim memory issues. You can claim anything you want. I don't need much. I just need the timeline to extend. I'm not interested. It's a one-time offer. You won't get another one. Then, it ends here. He looked at me for a long moment, and I made myself hold still and let him look, because I'd learned a long time ago, working on cars for men exactly like him, that flinching first is its own kind of confession. His face shifted into something I had seen before, a long time ago, in other men, in other situations. The face of a person who is calculating which threat will land. Your daughter, Hannah, is at Stamford Academy. She gets out at 3 p.m. Mrs. Sullivan picks her up most days. Sometimes she walks to the bus stop on Elm Street. I'm told she likes the bench near the corner, the one with the maple tree. The shop went very quiet. I could hear the compressor cycling in the back, and underneath that, my own pulse, which had gone slow and heavy in a way I recognized from exactly 2 other moments in my life, both of them in hospital rooms. I stopped what I was doing. I set down the wrench I had been holding, carefully, because my hands had gone still in the particular way they only go right before they stop being careful. I walked around the workbench. He took a step back. "Get out of my shop, Mr. Vance, right now. I'm just observing what's in the public record. Get out." He held my eyes for another second. Then he picked the check up off the workbench, folded it, put it back in his coat pocket, and walked out. I stood in the doorway and watched him cross the lot to a black sedan I hadn't noticed pull in, and I didn't move again until his taillights were gone around the corner of Pacific Street. Then my legs went, just for a second, the way they do after you've been holding a brace position longer than your body wanted to. I put both hands flat on the workbench and breathed until the shaking stopped. I called Detective Robert Mendez of the Greenwich PD's Investigative Division 10 minutes later. He had been the original local point of contact for the case before federal jurisdiction took over. My hands were still not entirely steady when I dialed. I made myself say the details in order, plainly, the same way I'd walk a customer through a diagnostic, because I didn't trust myself to say them any other way without my voice doing something I didn't want it to do in front of a detective I was meeting for the first time. I told him exactly what Preston Vance had said about Hannah, exactly which streets and which times he had referenced, exactly what the offer had been, and exactly what I was concerned about. Mendez took it seriously. He coordinated with the FBI within 2 hours. A protective detail was assigned to Hannah's school and to my shop within 24 hours. The threat itself was added to the federal indictment as witness intimidation, which substantially increased Preston's exposure. I didn't wait for Mrs. Sullivan that afternoon. I closed the shop 40 minutes early, which I had not done once in 3 years of owning it, and I drove to Stamford Academy myself, arriving 20 minutes before the bell, and I sat in the truck in the pickup line with both hands on the wheel at 10 and 2 like a student driver, watching the front doors the way I used to watch oil pressure gauges on a car I didn't trust yet. When Hannah came out, backpack half-zipped, wooden car already in her fist, she saw the truck and broke into a run. The particular delighted run of a 7-year-old who has no idea anything in the world is wrong. I got out and picked her up off the ground entirely, which I almost never did anymore because she always said she was getting too big for it, and she laughed and said, "Daddy, you're squishing the car." And I had to turn my face away for a second before I answered, because I didn't want her to see what was actually happening on it. "Sorry, Bug," I said. "Bad day. Good now." She didn't ask what kind of bad day. She just patted my shoulder twice, the way she'd seen Mrs. Sullivan do to me once, and said, "Pasta?" And I said yes. And that was the whole conversation. And it was exactly enough. Preston's attorneys initiated plea negotiations within a week. The plea agreement was finalized on January 6, 2025. Preston Vance pleaded guilty to 1 count of wire fraud and 1 count of witness tampering. He was sentenced to 36 months in federal custody. He agreed to restitution of $14.2 million to Ashworth Capital Management. He surrendered his interest in the firm. He was barred from the financial services industry by the SEC. I testified at his sentencing hearing on January 8, 2025, in the U.S. District Court in New Haven. My testimony lasted 47 minutes. I described the original engine bay observations, the timeline of the aftermarket modifications, the technical authentication issues, and the conversation in my shop on November 23rd. The prosecutor was thorough. The defense attorney's cross-examination was brief, because there was very little to dispute. At one point, while I was describing the conversation in my shop, I looked up and found Preston watching me from the defense table with an expression I hadn't expected. Something closer to tired than angry, like a man who had run out of moves long before he ran out of ego. I held his eyes for exactly as long as it took to finish my sentence, then looked back at the prosecutor, because I had decided a long time before that morning that he didn't get any more of my attention than the facts required. The judge sentenced Preston at the upper end of the guideline range. She specifically cited the threat against Hannah as an aggravating factor. When I walked out of the courthouse that afternoon, the sky was that particular shade of January gray that Connecticut gets in the days after a storm passes through. The air was cold and dry. I drove back to Stamford. I picked Hannah up from school. We made spaghetti for dinner. She wanted to watch a movie afterward. We watched the one about the dog and the postman that she had seen 4 times already. She fell asleep on the couch with her head on my arm and her wooden toy car on her chest. I carried her to bed. I did not see Vivian for the rest of January. She came to the shop on the last Wednesday of January, 2025. January 29th, it was 2:14 in the afternoon. Hannah was still at school. Mrs. Sullivan was at her sister's place in New Haven for the week. Vivian was in jeans and a wool coat. She had a small wrapped package under her arm. She came in through the front. The bell over the door chimed. I was working on a 2016 Audi A4 with a misfire that was, this time, exactly what it appeared to be. She stood near the front of the shop. She didn't come closer. I should have called. You shouldn't have to. She held out the package. It was wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with twine. Klaus Reinhardt arranged this with Annalise Miller. He said you'd know what it was. I took it. I knew what it was before I unwrapped it. The shape was familiar. It was Heinrich's 2010 work log volume. The original, not a scan. The actual leather-bound book Annalise had kept in her custody since her father's death in 2018. I looked at her. How? Klaus knew Annalise personally. He told her what happened. She agreed to lend the volume directly to me for 90 days under her authority, as Heinrich's heir. The museum was notified, but the loan is through her, not the institution. I'm supposed to return it to her in April. Klaus thought you should see it before then. I opened the book. The pages were thick, slightly yellowed at the edges, hand-numbered. The book smelled like the inside of every European workshop I had ever stood in, machine oil and old paper and something like cold stone. And for a second, I had to close my eyes and just hold it, because grief sometimes arrives through your nose before it arrives anywhere else. Heinrich's writing was small and precise, mostly in German, with occasional notations in English, for parts that had been sourced from American suppliers. I found page 47, the work order for the 1973 Carrera RS Lightweight Refresh, dated June 14, 2010. My signature was at the bottom of the page in the apprentice authorization line. Below my signature, in Heinrich's hand, was a short note in German. I read it. I read it twice. It said, roughly translated, "The American apprentice has the hands. Whether he will have the patience is a question only time can answer. I am inclined to believe he will." Vivian was watching me. What does it say? I closed the book gently. I set it on the workbench. It says he thought I might turn out all right. She nodded slowly. Did you? Turn out all right? I thought about it for a moment. My wife thought so. My daughter, I hope, will think so. The rest is harder to be sure about. She did not respond immediately. The shop was quiet. Outside, a truck went by on Pacific Street. The light through the front windows was thin and clean. She said, "I want to thank you properly. Not with money. With something that would actually mean something. You don't have to." "I know, but I want to." I waited. "Klaus told me there's a Porsche restoration program at Lime Rock Park. They're trying to build a permanent classics workshop. They need a senior technical lead. The pay is less than I'd guess you make here. The work is what you used to do. Klaus said your name when they asked him." I looked at her. "That's not your thanks. That's Klaus's recommendation. He said he wouldn't have known to recommend you if I hadn't asked him about you." I did not say anything for a moment. I have a daughter who needs school continuity. I have a business I built from nothing. I can't just move. Lime Rock is 45 minutes from Stamford. You could keep this shop. You could do both. They wanted me to ask if you would have a conversation with them. That's all. A conversation. Why are you doing this? She held my eyes. Because you did something for me in September that I didn't ask you to do and didn't know how to thank you for. I've thought about it for 4 months. I'm not asking for anything in return. I'm just trying to make sure that the person who made my life make sense again gets to do work that matches who he actually is. I looked at the work log on the bench. I looked at her. I looked at the wooden toy car that Hannah had left on the workbench that morning before school. I'll have the conversation. That's all I'm asking. She turned to leave. She paused at the door. "Ethan." "Yes, I'm sorry about the joke in September. I didn't know who you were. You weren't supposed to know. That's not what the work is for." She looked at me for another moment. "Will you bring Hannah to Lime Rock if you take the conversation forward? I'd like to meet her properly. Not in a garage, not as a CEO, just as a person. If she wants to come, yes. Thank you." She left. I stood at the workbench for a long time after she was gone. I looked at the work log. I opened it to page 47 again. I touched my own 24-year-old signature with the tip of my finger. Hannah came home at 3:15. She had drawn a picture at school of our apartment with a Porsche parked in front of it. I asked her if she'd ever been in a Porsche. She said no. She said she thought she might like to be one day. She said the picture was just in case it happened. I taped the picture to the front of the refrigerator. That night, after she was asleep, I sat in the kitchen with Heinrich's work log open on the table and the wooden toy car next to it. I thought about what Heinrich had written. I thought about Caroline. I thought about the 14 years between the page in front of me and the moment I had stood in Vivian Ashworth's garage and recognized a bracket that I had helped install when I was 24 years old and didn't know yet who I was going to become. Some things take 14 years to come back to their proper place. Some things take less time than that. You don't always know which is which until you stop fighting the way time works. I thought about a hot Saturday in a German workshop and a paperback Caroline never finished reading, and I understood finally that the parts of people we love best don't disappear when they die. They just wait in places we haven't gotten brave enough to open yet, the way Heinrich's bracket had waited 14 years for someone to recognize what it was. I closed the book. I turned off the kitchen light. I went to bed. So, here's my question for you. If you had been Ethan that morning in September, standing in that garage in Greenwich, recognizing the work of a man who had taught you everything you knew, with a woman behind you who had just made a joke at your expense, what would you have done? Would you have told her the truth right then? Would you have walked away? Or would you have done what Ethan did and let the work speak for itself? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. And if this story made you feel something, if it made you think about the people in your own life who have been quietly carrying skills and stories you never knew about, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because the people who built the world we live in usually don't tell you that they built it. You have to learn to look.